Take care of your feet is the sign on an abandoned meatpacking plant on the outskirts of Springfield. Locals believe that the ghosts of the children who died there roam the grounds. Long ago, back in 1986, a suddenly widowed Sam Boothman brought his two sons to work there. They were twins 7 years old, Ernie and Mark. His wife used to babysit the children, but she passed away prematurely from cancer. Sam was not rich, relatives lived in another city, and after the funeral there was almost no money left. The man had no choice but to go to work and take the children with him. Halfway through the shift, the boys sat in front of their father. He put 2 chairs at the end of the shop so they wouldn't get in the way. After the lunch break, he returned early to feed the children fresh poppy seed buns, since outsiders were not allowed in the canteen. But the children were not there. A frightened Sam appealed to the supervisor, Neil O'Donovan, not to start the conveyor belt until he found his sons. Neil was very annoyed. The longer production was idle, the more money he was losing. Finally, he announced that if the children were not found in half an hour, work would continue. Sam's co-workers joined the search. They went around the shop, searching secluded places and calling for the boys, but no one responded. Half an hour passed, and by order of the boss, the conveyor belt started up again. Sam could only hope that the children were not hurt and were waiting for him either outside or at home. By evening, the situation had not changed. Mark and Ernie seemed to have fallen through the ground. The inconsolable father contacted the police. Lawmen arrived at the meatpacking plant. First, they issued a fine for the fact that the children were near life-threatening equipment and probably did not know about safety. Then the search began. While the children were searched with dogs, specialists took samples of meat at different stages of production. The results came in a few days and shocked people. Small human bones were found in the sausage. Even later, it was discovered that children had climbed into the pipe where the meat was thrown. Since the conveyor belt was turned off, they didn't realize that something could move inside. Apparently, they decided to play hide and seek, and it cost the children their lives. All products had to be recalled from sale, and the meatpacking plant suffered huge losses. Neil O'Donovan declared Sam a debtor and threatened that if he refused to pay the fine, he would put him in jail. The next day, the poor man was found dead in the shop. He couldn't bear the misfortune that had befallen him. The meatpacking plant went back to business as usual, but with a strict rule: no children on the premises. But the terrible events were just beginning. On Friday, a cattle receiver said that someone frightened the animals and they almost crushed her. On the same day, there were complaints that someone had violated the ban and brought children. Stomping and children's laughter were heard in different workshops. In some places, equipment was out of order, as if nuts had been thrown in instead of meat. Furious, Neil O'Donovan ordered to stop the conveyor belt and search the mill from top to bottom. He himself climbed into one of the machines, which was responsible for processing the meat, together with the machine operator. Terrible screams attracted people's attention. Somehow, the conveyor started working again, leaving the boss without legs. After a while, employees began to quit. There were more and more accidents at the meat processing plant, and all of them were related to leg injuries. Finally, the plant declared bankruptcy and closed. But the story didn't end there. In 2016, a group of thrill seekers, 3 guys and a girl, climbed onto the property to film an exclusive. The girl injured her leg when she fell through on the stairs, and the guys got stuck in the freezer. The door literally slammed shut behind them. They heard the children's laughter too, but couldn't post the footage. On the way out, the cameraman slipped, and so successfully that he shattered the camera. They say that on Halloween, you can hear the stomping of feet if you stand next to a fence. One day, a colleague and I were sent to another city for a refresher course. Brian, that was my colleague's name, offered to drive his car to save money on tickets. On the day of departure, the weather forecasters promised bitter cold. I was afraid that the car would stall somewhere along the way and we would freeze. But Brian assured me we'd be fine. He seemed to like me and wanted to be alone with me. Too bad the guy wasn't my type. On the way, the navigator slowed down. The picture froze, showing that there was a fork in the road ahead, but I couldn't see where to turn. "What do you think, Jesse?" I crinkled my nose, but I didn't correct it. I didn't want to fight at the beginning of the trip. "I have no idea. I've never been here before. I'm a homebody. You know that." "Let's turn around. We'll go to the nearest village and ask the locals." I shrugged. We turned onto a narrow asphalt road and went deep into the forest. I didn't like the route. It didn't look like it was traveled very often. "Should we go back?" "Not an option. We'll get stuck. We can't turn around." It's true. I just now noticed that the trees had encircled the car and the road had narrowed to one lane. Shit, what if someone's coming towards us? I said. Brian remained silent. Finally, the woods receded and a field began. We drove up a hill and stopped. It was getting dark, so I got a good look at the lights in the windows. A village. "That's good." Brian's cheerful. "We'll ask them for directions. We'll come back." When we pulled up, I raised my eyebrows in surprise. The 3 houses could hardly be called a village. It was all the more surprising to see that the shutters were decorated with carvings. The houses were surrounded by neat fences, and the windows were covered with clean curtains. "Wait for me in the car. I'll be right there." Brian smiled at me and got out, hurrying toward the nearest house. I rolled my eyes. He was the only thing I needed right now. I was tired, hungry, and my legs were stiff. So I got out and followed the guy. The door was opened by an old woman with a round face and lots of wrinkles. Her old-cut sundress hung on her like a hanger. Her small eyes looked us over from head to toe, and she mumbled, "We don't often get visitors. Come in quickly. Don't let the frost into the hut." We looked at each other and went in. Then my mouth opened even more. From inside the hut looked like in a children's fairy tale. Everything was bright, beautiful, cozy, purely rustic color. There was a pot in the stove, and the smell of homemade dumplings wafted to my nose. The old woman kept muttering, sweeping non-existent crumbs from the table. "And how did you end up in such a wilderness? Sit down, you must be tired." "I'll treat you to some homemade dumplings," my grandmother told us. It was beyond us to refuse. I didn't notice how homemade nalevka appeared on the table, and an old man appeared in the hut. The same wrinkled, smiling man, wearing an oversized shirt. So as not to be rude, I made conversation. "Why don't you move closer to civilization yourself? It must take all day to get to the store." "The store? Why do we need a store?" The landlady was surprised. I looked at her and froze. For a moment I thought that the old woman's eyes were inhuman, with huge bruises under them. A foul odor touched my nose. I blinked, and the obsession was gone. I looked over at Brian, who was munching on the treat. "Yeah. No need, I guess. You're right. I didn't feel like eating for some reason. I was horrified to see my coworker downing a shot of tincture, and I kicked him under the table." "What?" Brian looked at me with unfocused eyes. "Nothing. How are you supposed to drive a car when you're drunk?" "You don't have to go anywhere," the old lady smiled. Except it was a creepy smile, wider than a man can smile. "It takes at least 4 hours to get to the highway. You better get some rest. We've already made the bed." "When?" I looked at her thoughtfully. My thoughts were confused. It smelled like flavorful dumplings or something rotten. "Just now. You eat. Don't be shy." 2 more old men came out of the other room. They stood next to their hosts and looked at us with a smile. "We need to leave here. Now," ran through my head. I looked at Brian and mentally groaned. My coworker was lying face down on the table, sound asleep. The old men, as if they'd lost interest in us, left, then returned with a huge cauldron. The pot was placed in the center of the room on a metal stand. The hostess was carrying wood, the old men water. They conversed in an unfamiliar language. It was more like a collection of coughs, grunts, and slurps. I blinked. Instead of a cozy room, I saw a dugout with a plate of maggots in front of me. I squealed, jumping out of my seat. Even Brian woke up, raising his head. "Jesse, what are you doing?" He said I grabbed him under the elbow and dragged him toward the door. The old men turned their attention to us. "Where are you going in the middle of the night?" "There's a blizzard outside," said the old man. His voice was high, like a woman's. I squealed again, pushing Brian through the door. It opened and 3 men came into the room. My coworker, unable to stand on his feet, fell right on top of them. I stepped over a pile, snow hitting me in the face. "Brian, please get up." I told him I pulled him as hard as I could to the car. I guess my persuasion worked. He pulled himself together, ran with me to the car, and fell into the seat. I slammed the door and tried to start the engine. The old men came out of the house and surrounded the car. But then the engine started. I turned around in the yard without fear of hitting anyone and raced back along the barely visible road. In the side mirror, I saw that the strange creatures were running after us, almost keeping up. Miraculously reaching the big road, I breathed a sigh of relief. The car was no longer being chased. I arrived in town in the morning. My hands were shaking and my throat was dry. Brian woke up soon after, and I told him everything. He was so shocked that he didn't speak for hours. I worked as a chief accountant in a large IT company. In honor of the anniversary, my bosses ordered a one-time payment to all employees, including those who had retired or had worked for us for a while and quit. It was easier said than done. I had to pull up the archive with all the data and search for each employee with my colleagues. My intentions were noble, the company was doing well, and we, together with the personnel officers, got to work. In my hands, I got a personal file of a man who worked for the chief as a personal driver a year ago. I started digging through the database, then filed requests to other organizations to find some data. The phone number in the file was out of date, and the bank said that they didn't have such a citizen, and that his paycheck went to some other account. After a short time, it turned out that the driver's name was fake, and he himself had been in jail in more than once. This case was taking an interesting turn. It's unclear how he managed to infiltrate his way into such a position. I started digging deeper, and after a couple days, I had an unusual dossier. Turns out the man had been to almost every prison in the state I lived in. The reasons were trivial. Petty robberies, drunken brawls, run-ins with the authorities. In other words, all of Billy's problems were at the bottom of the bottle. A lot of activity ended in prison for the murder of 2 comrades. The next day, the court transcript came to me. The longer I read the witness statements, the more what had happened seemed strange to me. Just after Billy had been fired from our company, the man had failed to show up for work several times. He had gone to a smaller town to visit his alcoholic friend Alexander. We decided to celebrate the meeting, bought alcohol, and went to the countryside with 2 other men, Vladimir and Stepan. Having chosen a picturesque place, they built a fire, fried shish kebab, and then a stranger came out of the forest. He was dressed very decently, a clean suit, not new, but neat, shiny shoes, an expensive watch, and a heavy ring with some symbol. Billy noted in the statement that the man had incredible gray eyes. The stranger first asked for directions to the nearest gas station, then left, but soon returned with a package. He put tincture, cheese, and smoked sausage on the table. The men were drunk by then and welcomed the stranger with open arms. They got to talking and learned that the guest worked at a sawmill nearby and was on his way home from his shift. Why he was walking through gullies and not on the road, and why he didn't know where the gas station was, it didn't occur to them, and his suit wasn't much use at the sawmill, let alone his shoes. Further in the protocol, there were many everyday details, and everything ended abruptly and incomprehensibly. At some point, the stranger called Vladimir to him, they moved away, and Billy lost sight of them. Then they came back. Billy's acquaintance looked very sad. His eyes were red, as if he had been crying. It even seemed that he had sobered up. The man had meanwhile taken Stepan into the woods, and the situation was repeated. Strangely, no one resisted or questioned anything, as if what was happening was the norm. Billy's friend refused to go. He was just grilling kebabs and was busy, so the gray-eyed guest left him alone. Then the man suddenly started talking about karma, about how bad deeds boomerang back, and began to ask what they planned to do. Billy didn't like it. He rudely sent the stranger far away with his sermons. Suddenly, Vladimir and Stepan got up at the same time and walked toward him. One wrapped his arm behind his back, and the other kicked him in the kidneys. Alexander left the meet and rushed to the rescue, and a vicious fight ensued. Billy said that the eyes of the acquaintances were cold and angry, as if they wanted to kill him in earnest. Meanwhile, the guest went back to the table and began to eat the cheese in peace, looking at what was happening with a smile. Almost a page of text was devoted to describing the fight. At some point, a knife appeared. Billy came to himself among two corpses. A dazed and sober Alexander was sitting next to him, his hands shaking. The gray-eyed stranger was nowhere to be found. The men packed their things and fled the scene. Of course, they were quickly identified and brought to justice. In principle, there was nothing strange in the story, and not such things happened because of alcohol. But after the testimony of Alexander and Billy came the results of expertise. According to everything, it turned out that the friends tricked Vladimir and Stepan into the forest, then killed them and robbed them. No trace of the kebab, no bottles, no gray-eyed man had been found. They did not sit by the woods, they did not talk, and no one came to the gas station store at that time. Moreover, there was no sawmill in those woods. The unfortunate alcoholics were not believed, and the judge gave them 15 years each. None of them went free. Interested in the story, I went to that very prison, hoping to find out the details. I needed an official paper on Billy's death to refer to it in my report, but of course it was just an excuse. I was sent from one supervisor to another for a long time. Finally, I was able to talk to the shift supervisors. They very reluctantly told me that both Alexander and Billy had died one day apart. Both of them had been stabbed to death by neighbors in the night. Before that, the former drinking buddies had been visited by the same man. The staff described him vaguely. Plain appearance, simple suit. The only thing they remembered was the incredible gray eyes and the heavy ring on his finger. I was never able to find out more. The records of those days were damaged.